All right, good morning, everybody. I'm sure I scared a lot of you last week by talking to you about your small group deliberation projects. I'm hoping that today's discussion will help make it a little less scary for all of you by giving you some advice over how to work best with your groups. I want you to be able to survive this project without killing each other. The good news here is that oftentimes students have actually told me they were scared to do this project and then tell me that they thought it was the most worthwhile project that we did in this class. The other good news there is that generally this project goes very well, at least in my lab sections. Usually this is the best project that students produce, and a lot of that I attribute to the small group factor here, that you all get to work with each other instead of just being left on your own to produce a 5-minute speech. Now you might remember that this is about a 17 to 20-minute project that you all are going to have, but you're going to be doing it in groups of, say, 6 to 8. And so you should be able to spread out the labor. You're actually going to spend less time actually speaking for this project, but you'll be spending a lot more time doing the first couple canons, getting it ready for the final project. So we're going to talk about the small group side of it since we talked about the deliberation side of it last week. I want to start off with a couple of quotations. I think this is the best description of small group communication that I've ever seen. It comes from Dan Rothwell's textbook on small group communication. And he actually opens up his textbooks with quotations from students who have taken his class. And at most universities, small group communication is not a required class. It could be at his, I don't really know. But nevertheless, these are quotations that he's gotten in his student evaluations at the end of the semester, and I think they're pretty clever. First one says, if God had ordered a committee to create the world, it would still be discussing proposals. Oftentimes, small group communication is kind of a slow and exhausting process. It doesn't always lead anywhere. Second one, for every group that I've enjoyed, there have been a dozen groups looking to make my life miserable and succeeding. I like that one a lot. And last but not least, I hate groups. I hate group assignments. I hate teachers who require group assignments. Take the hint. Again, small group communication not required at most universities. My guess is this student had to take small group communication, didn't really like doing so. Nevertheless, there's a general sentiment that small group communication is frustrating, is slow, is tedious, is annoying, is difficult. I think a lot of students and a lot of even grown adults and people who have graduated really struggle to do small group communication effectively. So what I'd like to do today is debunk some misconceptions and maybe give you some strategies for how you can get along in your groups. The other good news I have for you is that you have a lot of time between now and the end of the semester. You should have a lot of in-class lab time to work on this project. You also have time where you might want to meet with your group outside of class and make sure that you're all doing what you're supposed to be doing. But nevertheless, I want to make sure that this is a smooth process for you, and so I'm here to give you some tips. I'd encourage you to take some notes so that you don't all kill each other when you actually have to do the project. So let's start off by talking through some stories that you all have had. What I'd like you to do is think back on your experiences. All of you have probably worked in at least one small group in your lifetime. Talk to a neighbor about whether you have any horror stories of a group gone terribly wrong. Maybe some of you have had some good experiences with small group communication. Tell us your successes. If any of you have good strategies for how to make small group communication more effective or more efficient or less miserable for a lot of us, go ahead and talk to a neighbor. Just reflect on your own experiences. What comes to mind when you think of small group communication? Take a second or two, talk to one of your neighbors. We'll come back together as a full class. It's always kind of fun for me to watch you all talk. With a topic like this, I get a lot of eye rolling. I get a lot of very animated facial expressions and gestures. I get a lot of people nodding and smiling and saying, oh yeah, that's cool. right? So there's kind of a mix, but my sense is a lot of you probably have horror stories about small group communication. I'm hoping that some of you will be brave and share any one of these categories. So let's see if we can get some hands. What are some horror stories you've had, success stories, strategies for how to make this better? Go ahead. Yep, I think a lot of us have had that experience. We were in high school, we had a group project, we had to do the whole thing. That's the story I told to my class yesterday. I had a project, it was over winter break, it was a 20-minute long presentation. The two people in my group were good friends with each other, and it was very clear that neither one of them wanted to do well on the presentation or even do the presentation. So I got stuck doing a 20-minute presentation by myself, and there was my junior year winter break. I lost the whole thing to this stupid project that I had to do myself. You can probably relate to that story. Oftentimes when that happens, there are other ways that people could have intervened differently, but it was very clear that these two girls didn't want to work with me, and so it goes. You can also probably imagine that I was kind of a type A high school student. I was generally a straight A student, and these girls were probably C students and didn't care if they got D's or failed. So yeah, we've been in that situation. What else? I saw a couple of other hands. Any other stories or success stories, strategies? Y'all are a little quiet as a class. Somebody be brave and tell us something. Go ahead.
I had one my junior year of college for my civil lab that I had. It was, we had papers that were due every week.
Okay.
And I had 3 other group members that we would put towards the groups. And none of them did any work, and it ended up being anywhere from 20 to 25 pages every week that was due. PA formats. And it just was a nightmare with all my other lab classes on top of it. It was like 18 credits worth that semester.
Yeah, so it's frustrating if your group experience doesn't go well and you have a whole bunch of other things going on. I am sensitive to the fact that you all are taking other classes. I don't think that you just come to me for public speaking, that's all you do, in the same way that you all are not my only class. But nevertheless, we want to make sure that our experiences are as smooth as possible. Has anybody had any good stories working in small groups? Any successes? Yeah? Okay, so you had a class that got stuff done. What makes you think that that experience was better? What do you think made it better? Good, so it's important to delegate tasks. It's important to know who's going to do what. It's important to hold people accountable for those things. Anybody else have any success stories or strategies for us? They don't have to be from your own experience. You can think of just what do you think would be helpful with small group communication? Yeah? Okay, so you want to make sure that you have some good communication going among your group, whether that's a group chat on GroupMe or Facebook, whether you make a Google Docs page. We'll talk a little bit about online small group communication versus face-to-face communication toward the end of class today. But yeah, you want to make sure that people are communicating as much as they can and that they're all on the same page and they all know where to find the information. Any other strategies you all can think of? All right, then probably I need to do some review. I'll tell you that I had one success story that comes to mind, and that success story is when I was in high school. I was on an executive board for, actually I was the president of a group that I belonged to, and I really enjoyed working for the organization. I had a lot of fun with it. I pretty much handpicked my executive board because we had elections, but there weren't a whole lot of people who wanted to run for stuff, and so I talked my friends into running along with me. Said, you look like you'd make a good vice president, you'd be good for this, you'd be good for that, you'd be good for that. And I found that it was really helpful when we spent a lot of time getting to know each other as people and not just doing the things that we needed to get done for the organization, but kind of being friends along the way. I'll tell you that I had some small group communication projects in college, and I'm still friends with some of the people from those small groups. I didn't necessarily expect to be friends with them 10 years later, but it is possible. So some strategies for small group communication we're going to talk about today. I'm glad that you all are here because you will be helpful to lead our conversations. Now, I want to just kind of get a general sense of what you already know. So take a look at the question up on the board here. There's a lot of common misconceptions about how small group communication works. So it doesn't surprise me necessarily that some of you are a little hesitant to share strategies because maybe you're not sure that they're right or maybe you haven't yet developed them. But I want you to take a look at the options up on the board here. I'll tell you one of those is true. The other three are kind of misconceptions about small group communication. What I'd like you to do is the same thing we've been doing most of the semester and show me on your fingers 1, 2, 3, or 4, A, B, C, or D. Which one do you relate to? And as you do that, try not to look around the room. Try and come up with your own best judgment of which one you think is right. Okay. See what we come up with here. 10? Okay. All right, so I'm seeing a pretty even mix. I'm seeing a fair amount of B's. I'm seeing a lot of A's and D's. I'm not seeing a whole lot of C's here. Nevertheless, there are some common misconceptions. I'm going to walk you through some of these misconceptions so that you don't approach your small group headed for disaster. So the first one that I want to talk about here is option A up here. So we have the misconception that effective small group communication always avoids conflict. I think that's a very Minnesota or North Dakota nice way of looking at how small groups work. I've said to you before, first of all, before I stereotype too much, I'll remind you that I grew up in Minnesota. I've been actively fighting the culture I grew up in for the last 10 years or so. I think it's pretty common for it to be Minnesota or North Dakota nice. When we talked about civic and community engagement, I said that a lot of people think we're not supposed to talk about controversial topics, whether that's politics or race or gender or any number of things that we find uncomfortable. I think that often translates here to a perception that conflict is always bad. The culture, and not just in Minnesota or North Dakota, but in a lot of the US, has this perception that if people are fighting, that there's some kind of problem and that's always a bad thing. That is very much at odds with a lot of what the small group communication literature has to say. In particular, there's the 4-part model that you see up on the screen here. That was developed by Bruce Tuckman. You can see that it rhymes. It's got 4 stages here: form, storm, norm, and perform. It's helpful that they rhyme. What Tuckman says is that this is the process that a lot of groups go through, and it's not necessarily a linear process. It's not the case that you go through one, then go through the next, then go through the next, then go to the next. What each of these stages are different ways that groups can engage in or not engage in and ultimately get through conflict. And he says that a lot of groups think that if they just form, what they're doing is getting to know each other, trying to figure out who's going to do what, trying to talk about their strengths and weaknesses. That's a lot of what I'd like you to be doing in the next week or so, not just getting to figure out what topic you're going to use for your deliberation, but actually getting to know your group members. When people are in that forming stage, what they often do is just take the time to learn a little bit about each other and maybe make some tentative plans for what they hope to accomplish. Now, some groups go directly from forming to performing. So that means that they go directly from, I have this plan, we all met, we all talked about it, we all did our part, it was great, everything worked out fine. For most groups, that is not the case. Most groups will end up thinking that they'll go straight from forming to performing and end up in the storming stage, the second stage. That second stage of storming is what happens when people get a little bit ahead of themselves. Maybe they think the plan is going really well, and then they find out 1 or 2 group members are really upset, and then the rest of the group starts complaining, and everybody's fighting with each other. It's not uncommon for small groups to engage in storming or conflict, but it's actually sometimes a good thing. What Tuckman says about it is actually that people will use that conflict to recalibrate things that maybe they didn't foresee or didn't see coming when they were in their original planning stages. So if you think about this, we talked last week a little bit about the differences between having an argument and making an argument. When you're in that forming stage, when you're trying to get to that performing stage, ultimately you're trying to make an argument, but sometimes you end up having an argument along the way. A lot of you have probably had arguments with friends or significant others or your parents, and it was kind of frustrating to be caught up in the middle of it, but after you got through that conflict, you kind of recalibrated boundaries, you figured out whose role it is to do what. You figure out some things that maybe you should or shouldn't say. And oftentimes, even though you've had the experience of going through conflict with that person, you can say your relationship is stronger. It's kind of that mentality of that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger just on a relationship level. And so sometimes norming is actually a good thing. What Tuckman says is that sometimes groups fail to norm, and that's what ends up causing them to storm in the first place. So conflict isn't always a bad thing, and we use norming to try and recalibrate our relationships to each other. We try to recalibrate our relationships to the task that we're trying to accomplish. And so it's often the case that we will try to get to performing, and if you rush to performing and you think your group is doing everything right, what could happen to you is a week or a day or 10 minutes before your deliberation, your group gets into a huge fight because of some unresolved issue that you didn't go through the storming phase about. You're going to go through that storming phase now. So a lot of people think that if they avoid conflict, they'll just go straight from forming to performing. That's not usually how it works. Oftentimes, we're actually better off as a result of trying things out. There's a lot of trial and error in small group communication, and when we can norm and recalibrate and figure out who's going to do what and why, it often leads to better performance than groups that just go straight for consensus or straight for agreement. Now, there's another misconception here. There's another misconception about the relationship between tasks that you're supposed to accomplish and the relations among various group members. So what I'd like to have you all do is to actually try and fill in the graph that I have up here. Cohesion has to do with how well your group members get along with one another. Productivity has to do with how well you accomplish your task. What I'd like you to do is actually draw with your finger, what do you think happens in that relationship? As cohesion goes up, does productivity go along with it? Does it go down? Does it stay the same? Does it do something else? What I'd like to do is have all of you draw with your finger what you think that graph looks like. As productivity goes up, what happens to as cohesion goes up, what happens to your productivity? All right, I'm seeing a lot of people drawing this straight linear line. As cohesion goes up, productivity goes up with it. I saw a couple people draw different lines. It's actually a line that might surprise a lot of you, and it's actually what we call a curvilinear relationship. What that means is that cohesion is helpful. You want your group to get along. You want them to get along to a certain point. There's actually a point at which too much cohesion, too much getting along is a bad thing. Nevertheless, you're probably right that if your group isn't cohesive from the beginning, you're probably not going to be all that productive. That's why that forming stage is important. So why do you think productivity peaks around that middle level of cohesion? What do you think would lead to the downfall that explains the second half of that graph? Anybody want to say? Go ahead. People sacrifice productivity for, yeah. Yeah, so what happens is sometimes when we get a little too cohesive, we get distracted. We get distracted by other things that have to do with our relationship. If you're in that forming phase, what you're trying to do is build trust with the other members of your group. You want to feel like you can trust them. You want to feel like they're going to do what they say they're going to do. You want to feel like you know them as people. When you get to know each other a little bit too well, you end up talking about other things than what you're supposed to accomplish. This is what happens if you've had an hour-long meeting at the coffee shop and the first 10 minutes or so were productive, and then after that what you end up doing is talking about Game of Thrones or the Kardashians or what you're going to eat for lunch or where you're going to go this weekend. When groups get a little too cohesive, they get distracted from the task. One of the biggest misconceptions about small group communication is that it's one or the other. Either you can focus on the task or you can focus on the relationship. What most small group communication textbooks say is that most groups struggle to navigate the balance between the two, and that they're constantly tacking back and forth between too much task over here and too much relationship over here. And so what you have to do is if you find your group getting off task, you need to be that person who raises their hand and says, you know what, this has been fun, I'm glad we're having a good time here, but I also want to make sure we get this project done, circle around. You also want to make sure that if the group is a little bit too task-oriented, that you don't just focus on the thing you need to get done and call it even. Because what's going to happen is everyone's going to do things their own way. You're not going to be talking to each other. What's going to happen is you're going to end up talking around each other. And you're probably going to end up in that storming phase if you focus too much on the task and haven't spent enough time getting to know each other outside of the assignment that you're supposed to accomplish. So it's a constant back and forth, and most groups struggle to find the balance. They're constantly recalibrating that balance. So that's another big misconception. It's important that you spend equal time on both of those things. So you might need more time for the relationship than you think you need to. Now there's another part of this. This one's actually the one that a lot of you got right. This is the one that is true. We talked about majority rule, and a lot of you put up number 2 or B, saying that majority rule isn't always the best decision-making process. In countries like the United States that operate under a democratic republic kind of government, we often think of majority rule as one of the best decision-making processes. And a lot of us will, by default, turn to majority rule, especially if we feel a little bit frustrated with the process and we just need to figure something out. Let me see if you can generate, what do you think are some pros and cons of majority rule? Again, somebody be brave. Tell us something that's either good or bad about that process. See if we can get someone new. Yeah, go ahead.
Majorities often, they compromise so much that they never actually pick anything meaningful, any strong position.
Yeah, so sometimes majority rule can be more of a compromise, and not necessarily in the good way that we're inclined to think of compromise, that if people are really stuck and we take a vote, then people are stuck with that vote. Yeah. Any other pros and cons? I saw a couple other hands. Go ahead. Yeah, so majority rule can sometimes feel like a little bit too much pressure. I feel like I have to go along because we took a vote on it. Even though I think this is a really bad idea, there's a lot of pressure for me to then go along with what the rest of the group wants. Do you have another one? Yeah, what do you mean by tyranny of the majority? Mm-hmm. Well,
The problem when the majority tends to say, I want this guy out. Well, 10 people are voting that one guy. So that guy can't fight back. It's going to get those 10
yeah, so there's a certain strength in numbers, and if you are in the minority, you're often going to be unhappy with what the majority decides. The majority can be sort of tyrannical, coming from Tocqueville. So we've got a pretty good sense of that. Most of the time, we feel pretty good about democratic votes if we can make most people in the group happy. It's sort of this utilitarian impulse, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. If we can't satisfy everybody, majority rule is usually a good thing. But sometimes it can cause a lot of problems. We can have group members that are often unhappy. If you happen to be in the minority that doesn't win the vote, you're usually going to be unhappy. And minorities can be demographic. Minorities can also be whoever loses the vote. But oftentimes it's not the best decision-making process if not everyone's satisfied with it. We can contrast majority rule to minority rule. This is another way that some groups do operate. This is one that in the United States we're inclined to think of as not so good, but in other cultures sometimes minority rule can be the best strategy. Minority rule is what happens if you have a really strong leader, or maybe you have 2 or 3 people who take leadership in a group of, let's say, 10. What do you think would be some pros and cons of minority rule? Let's see if I can get someone else. I'll come back to you. Thank you, though. Sorry? Okay, yeah, so you've got a bunch of different points of view. You might not have that as much in minority rule. If it's just 1 or 2 people instead of the whole group engaging in a decision, that could sometimes be a problem. Other pros and cons that you could see with minority rule? So instead of having the whole group, you've got 1 or 2 people who are really excited about the project and they're going to tell the rest of the group how to do things. Did you want to go? Okay, yeah. Oftentimes, majority rule can feel kind of indecisive. If we wait around for too long, we can't always make decisions very quickly. So one of the pros of minority rule is that it can be very decisive. It can also help people who just don't feel like they're natural leaders or aren't particularly invested in the project to do something about that project. One of the big cons of minority rule is burnout. This is something that I saw happen in another organization I was part of in college. I had an organization that I had joined in my first year. My friend was the president of that organization. He was running the organization using a minority rule standpoint for about a year. And I'll tell you that he ran that organization in what another one of my colleagues likes to call, he ran it as a benevolent dictator. That means that he was the one who would tell people what to do, but he would often do it with other people's best interests in mind instead of his own best interest in mind. He wanted what was best for the group, and people trusted him, and they gave him a lot of authority and power to make decisions for the group. I can tell you that we had elections at the end of my first year, and he was graduating. So we elected another person as the president, and I asked him a basic question at the end of the election, and it was about some event that we were having the next week, and he said, "You can direct that straight to the department of that's not my problem anymore." What happened to this friend of mine is that he had burned out from having to make all of the decisions for that group for an entire year and from not having support from other people. Now, he probably could have been a little bit better at delegating, but the other people in the group weren't really all that invested in helping him out. So this can be helpful if you have a leader that you trust and somebody who can make strong and fair and usually quick decisions that everybody else will be happy with. But minority rule, for the most part, is not our preferred mode of operating. Some of your groups will operate by way of minority rule, and it will show in your presentations. The third type that Rothwell talks about then is unanimous decision making. That's everyone's on the same board, everybody's on the same page, and we have consensus among the group. Can you think of some pros and cons of unanimity or consensus-based decision making? What are some good or bad things about having everyone agree in order to go ahead with what you decided on? So instead of minorities and majorities, you have everyone in the group saying, yep, we agree on that one. We won't move forward until everyone agrees. Can you think of any benefits or drawbacks to that? I'll give you a couple then. One of the big pros of unanimity is that we have consensus. Oftentimes, if everybody feels satisfied with the decision, if everybody feels like their voice was heard, and we don't have one group member who feels left out, it often leads to people agreeing with each other and feeling better about the whole process. It often can slow down impulses that happen to take votes too quickly. You all have probably had this experience where a whole group voted on something, and then you voted, and a week later you realized you just voted yourself to go off a cliff, and you have to take a new vote because the thing you were trying to do didn't work. So if you can get to consensus, this is a good way of ensuring that we don't just rush to our instincts of the first couple things that come to mind. One of the big cons of unanimous decision-making is that it often is time-consuming. A lot of you have probably seen the movie 12 Angry Men. It's not just time-consuming, but it's frustrating when the one jury member says, I don't think this person's guilty, and the other 11 are saying, yeah, they're definitely guilty, right? And it takes a lot of time for that one person, that one holdout, to convince the rest of the people, actually, no, this person might not be guilty. So unanimous decision-making can be very time-consuming, but it's often good when we have decisions where everyone has to be on the same page. Now, there's a lot of parts of this deliberation project that you all are going to have to be on the same page about. You're going to have to be on the same page about what topic you choose. You're going to have to be on the same page about the 3 or 4 different options you explore to try and solve the problem that you chose. You're going to have to be on the same page about who's going to do what. You're going to have to be on the same page about which option you think is the best possible solution. So there's a lot of things that you have to agree upon. You don't necessarily have to get consensus, and you may not be able to get to consensus. But Rothwell actually ranks these, and he says unanimous decision-making is usually better than majority rule, and majority rule is usually a lot better than minority rule. And so majority rule isn't always necessarily the best way to make decisions. We're kind of accustomed to just taking votes periodically, and whoever gets left out of the vote gets left out of the vote. Now, there's another big problem with unanimous or consensus-based decision-making, and that's something called groupthink. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of this word before. Groupthink? Does anybody want to give us a working definition of what groupthink is? It's okay if you get it a little wrong, I'll help you, but again, be brave. Anybody want to tell us what they think groupthink means? That's all right. I'll go ahead and help you then. You all are a little quiet as a class. I'm going to encourage you to keep being brave. I know it can be a little bit hard to speak up in a room this loud or this large, but groupthink essentially means that everybody is nodding and smiling and voting yes when they're in their head. They're thinking absolutely not. So this political cartoon I've got on the left side of the screen here has a whole bunch of people saying, yep, we definitely agree, I, yes, yes, yes. And then in their head, they're thinking things like, nope, I don't like that. It's a bad idea. 1,000 times no, this is a really bad idea. What happens in groupthink is that we pretend that we have consensus, but it's a false sense of consensus that everyone's on the same page. Groupthink usually happens when people are afraid to be the devil's advocate, or when they're afraid to be the bad person in the group who says, I don't think that's a very good idea. It's another one of those things that can be a little bit cultural And it's a way of saying, I don't want to be the difficult one here. What I have on the right side of the screen is the lone penguin, and the motivational poster, it's a satirical one, says conformity. It's the one who's different that gets left out in the cold. A lot of people will agree to groupthink because they are afraid that other people are going to judge them if they're always the bad person in the group, raising their hand and saying, I don't like this group's idea. I can tell you that I've done this. I've been a part of this groupthink, and I think a lot of you probably have, where somebody suggests something and people can't think of anything better, and so we all just say, okay, I'm comfortable with that one. And then 2 weeks later, you find out, oh no, we're not actually comfortable with that one. There's not enough research on the topic. I don't know enough about this to feel comfortable presenting about it. I'm not interested in that topic. If everyone just nods and smiles, we have groupthink, and we think that we've gotten to consensus, and we actually haven't. Groupthink is one of those things that's going to make groups think that they're performing and then go back to that storming and norming phase. Because you will think that you're ahead of yourself and you're like, oh, this group is performing great. We all get along. We all agree on everything until you don't. And then when you don't, it's a giant disaster. So that's another thing I'd encourage you to be cautious about. Ultimately, what a lot of small group communication is trying to accomplish is this idea of synergy. This is what a lot of small group communication textbooks hold up as the gold standard of what you're supposed to do when you are engaging in small group communication. If you look up here, you've got a bunch of people with different puzzle pieces. I like to think of those puzzle pieces as the 5 canons of rhetoric. Some of you are probably really good with arrangement and style, but you don't really like delivery all that much. Some of you are really good with delivery, but you really hate invention. You hate looking for resources. You hate coming up with topics. You hate citing sources. A lot of you in your groups are going to have people who are naturally gravitating towards some of the canons and not others. Most of us are not always good at all 5 of the canons. Usually we're pretty good at 2 or 3 of them, and we could use some work on 2 or 3 of them. Ultimately, what you should be doing in this forming stage in this next week or so is not just getting to know each other, but thinking about who has what to bring to the table. If you're the kind of person who likes invention, maybe you take the leadership in invention and you let other people do a little bit more of the arrangements work or a little bit more of the delivery. Ultimately, what you're trying to work out is what is going to be most fair to you, but the idea of synergy is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If I assigned each of you to do a 20-minute deliberation over the next few weeks with the other classes that you're taking, you probably would not be able to do it. All of you have given by now 2 5-minute speeches. This group project that you're doing, you're actually going to be doing less time doing actual speaking than you normally would, but the first couple canons of this speech are going to be much harder for a lot of you. It's going to take a group effort. You're going to be creating a group preparation outline instead of an individual one. So you're going to have a lot more planning on the beginning end, but the idea is that a 20-minute presentation spread out between 6 to 8 people is a little bit more manageable, a little bit easier. A lot of people like to think that if they're performing well and they haven't gone through groupthink, that they've gotten to this synergy point. There's a cautionary tale that a lot of small group communication textbooks now offer as well, and that is the idea of negative synergy. You might think of negative synergy as dominoes, one person taking another person down. The caption under here says, why screw up alone when you can take the others down with you? So this is a common misconception. It was letter D that I put up in that question before. There's this misconception that more communication is always better communication. You've probably been in small groups where you were working on a task and you had some cohesion, but that cohesion was not about you all getting along and getting to know each other well. That cohesion was using your group time for a therapy session, using that group time to vent, using that group time to complain about the fact that somebody's making you do this thing that you don't want to do. I don't think that that's where you all want to be, but it's very common for students, especially when they're stressed out, to engage in this kind of negative synergy, that my shared problems are worse than my individual ones. If I start complaining, other people start complaining, and we get way off task, and we're feeling kind of bad about the project. So we've killed our relationship and we've killed the task. You want to be very cautious to avoid that negative synergy. Now, the last thing that I want to share with you all for misconceptions is this idea of social loafing. This is something that you all have probably encountered. Usually when I ask for horror stories, this is what students talk about. It's, I had a group of 5 people and I had to do the whole project because nobody else did their part. I like to imagine social loafing as if we are moving furniture. So if I asked these 3 guys in the front row here to help me lift this table, you would think that each of us would take a corner and lift with our knees and we'd share the weight. What often happens when you're moving, and you've probably seen this, is there's 3 people who are doing the work and one person just kind of standing there not really doing anything but looking like they're lifting the table. You don't want to be that person who just gets by through other people's labor. Now, a lot of times when I assign small group communication, students have a lot of anxiety in terms of how is my grade going to be impacted if I have a social loafer in my group or 4 or 5 social loafers in my group and I get hung up doing everything. What I say to that is that social loafing is actually rarely the individual's responsibility. It's usually a group thing. If there are social loafers, it can be the case that sometimes people are lazy. Sometimes people end up engaging in social loafing because they don't like the topic that the group's chosen, or they feel like they're not being listened to, or they feel like other people don't value them, or they have nothing to contribute. Social loafing can often be avoided if your group focuses on that relationship stuff early on and makes it very clear who's going to do what and that you all are responsible for holding each other accountable. The earlier you set deadlines, the more deadlines you set, the more accountability you all have. What often happens in college projects with social loafing is that people wait too long to say you have to have this done by X date, and X date is a day or 2 before the project, and the person shows up and they have nothing. If you have 3 or 4 deadlines, you have 3 or 4 opportunities to call that person out. Now, the way that I like to handle that anxiety around grading is to divide up an individual grade and a group grade. What I tell my lab students to do is to produce any evidence of what you did do to contribute to the project. Not looking for what other people didn't do, because that's usually a lot harder to prove, but I actually ask all of my group members to turn in everything that they did and to show evidence that they were the ones who did it. Now, I'll tell you that I had a student this summer who thought I was bluffing and thought that I would not fail him on a group project, and the student actually, their only contribution to the group project was to read, and I mean read from a manuscript, a part of the speech that somebody else had written for them. And I told this student that I got evidence from the rest of your group of what they did, and this person showed me that they wrote your part of the speech, and you read that part of the speech. That's not going to fly here, and I actually ended up failing that student because they didn't do their part on their deliberation. So if you're one of those people who's inclined to social loafing, if you think you can just get by, it is quite possible that you could fail this assignment and this class. I don't want that to happen to any of you, but I want you to recognize that when social loafing happens, there are lots of ways that the group can help avoid it, and a lot of it has to do with speaking up, and when someone's not doing their part, holding them accountable to it. Now, I have a cautionary tale for you all, and I'm not going to read this to you. A lot of you have probably seen it before. I'd like to say that there's a single source I can attribute to, but it's one of those common knowledge things. I can't find the original author. Nevertheless, this is a good cautionary tale about everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody, and what happens in group communication when social loafing does occur. So I want to warn you all of this possibility, because this is usually what my group deliberations look like at the end of the semester when you all do group evals. Sometimes it ends up being the case where everybody should have helped and nobody did. Just want to warn you about that one. We'll move on from there. So just for the last few minutes we have together, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit more about your small group deliberation and expectations that I have for you. You all are in my face-to-face classes, and by nature of being here today, I imagine that you're not the ones who I have to worry about with social loafing, but you are the ones who can help hold other people accountable for it. Now, in my face-to-face classes, I usually divide this up into groups of 6 to 8. The reason why I do that is because a lot of small group communication textbooks say that the best size for a group to be functional is actually 7. And they've run a whole bunch of experimental studies on this, and if you have 5, it's too few. If you have 8, it might be too many, or you don't have somebody to break the tie. So ideally, we want to have about 6 to 8 of you in a group. In my online classes, I have them in groups of 3 to 4, and they only go for 10 to 12 minutes. You all are going for 17 to 20. The reason for that is because it's much harder to communicate online. It's much harder to get this kind of project done. It's harder to get everyone on the same page. I'll remind you all of the expectations for the assignment. You're going to choose some kind of problem. Ultimately, your thesis for this project is going to be some governing body should some specific policy that's currently not being enacted, whether that's social or political in nature. It's probably going to be set up as a problem, cause, solution. So I want to remind you of not only the policy proposals chapter of your textbook, but also the stasis theory ideas that we talked about a few weeks ago, the Toulmin model triangle of claim, evidence, and reasoning. I want you to remember the parts of making an argument and not just having an argument. In your other classes or in your other speeches, a lot of what you're being evaluated on is the final product. So if you come to me after speech 1 or speech 2, I often get students say, I worked really hard on this speech. I don't understand why I got the grade that I got. And the speech went better in rehearsal than it did on delivery day. And I said, I can't grade your rehearsal. I can only grade the product of your delivery. This is a kind of a unique assignment because it's both of those things. I'm actually grading you on the process and the product. So behind the scenes, you all are going to be engaging in a lot of small group communication. You're going to be engaging in a lot of deliberation, trying to figure out what policy you want to tackle, what possible solutions you have, which one you think is the best solution. You're going to actually show your work in your speech when you deliver that. So in your speech, I should actually see you telling us what the problem is and what's causing it. I should see which 3 or 4 options you considered, and then I should finally have, near your conclusion, a sense of why the policy that your group is advocating is the best of those 3 or 4 options. So I'm evaluating you on the product because you're all delivering your speech, but I'm also kind of evaluating you on the process. I'm going to learn a little bit about what kinds of decisions you made and how you made them. I'm going to hear in your evaluations how the group functioned or dysfunctioned. I want to know all of that, and I'm going to be grading you on both of those things, or your lab instructor will be grading you on those things. So I've got a couple recommendations for you. The first recommendation I have for you is to get an early start. It's often the case that individual speakers come to me, and when I ask them on self-evaluations, what would you do differently for your next speech? They say, well, I really wish I had given myself more time for the last 2 canons. I wish I had had more time to rehearse and practice memory and delivery. In order to do that, what I always tell them is that means that you have to have your preparation outline done very early. By the time you get through that preparation outline, you should have done all of the invention, arrangement, and style work to make the best possible manuscript version of your speech. Then you should also practice with that preparation outline a whole bunch before you draft your speaking outline. So you want to, again, work backwards. If you want to have, say, a week or a week and a half to practice your speech as a group, that means that you got to get started pretty quickly. You got to figure out what you're going to include in the project. You want to get an early start on it, and you don't want to waste a whole lot of time on topics that the whole group isn't necessarily invested in. The second piece of advice I have for you based on that idea of task and relationship is that you want to meet early and meet often. You want to get to know the members of your group, not just as people who are going to do this speech with you, but as people who you get to see and value as possible friends, or at least as people with valid opinions. If you want to value their opinions, if you want to have your opinions valued, it's important that everybody in the group speaks up if they have something that they want to contribute to the group. I have this idea, and I think you all might like it. You had this idea, and I'm going to tell you in the nicest way possible that I don't think it's going to work. You have this idea, and it sounds interesting, but we have to come back together and schedule another meeting. You're going to be responsible for all of the communication that happens in your group. It's not necessarily the case that more communication is always better communication. Beware of that fear of negative synergy. The third thing that I recommend for you all is to be as clear as possible about what's expected of you. So what do you expect from the assignment? What does your instructor expect of you? All of your lab instructors should have given you a rubric detailing what it is that they're looking for in this project. It should be in line with the requirements I'm giving you in here. If it's not, you might want to ask your lab instructor. So you want to make sure that you're as clear as possible about what you're supposed to include and what you're being graded on and what you need to do to make sure you're meeting the needs of the assignment. You also want to be as clear as possible about who's going to do what. You might have some people that are more inclined toward leadership. You might have people who are more inclined toward following. You might have people who are really strong in one canon who really want to take the lead on that canon, and somebody else takes the lead on another canon. Ultimately, what you want to do is divide up the labor as much as possible and to let each other know, I'm comfortable doing this, I'm less comfortable doing that. Is there a way that I can do more of the things that I'm good at as opposed to everybody doing everything? So you're going to have to divide that out. I want to make sure that you all are doing your part. I don't want to see anybody social loafing. I don't want to hear reports that somebody did nothing to contribute to a group project, because that's frustrating for everyone involved. Usually that person doesn't get a good grade, usually the rest of the group doesn't get as good of a grade as they would have gotten. Sometimes if somebody's really doing nothing and you can show evidence that you went above and beyond, I like to reward that kind of behavior, but only if you've really tried to prevent that social loafing. Again, it's rarely the case that it's just that individual's fault and that they're lazy. What I often say is that the worst that happens in my classroom is that you all get a bad grade. The worst that happens in most everyday life situations is much worse than that. Maybe somebody gets fired. Maybe your company loses a lot of money or loses a contract with another company. Maybe you all create a hostile work environment and you have to be stuck with your colleagues for the next 10 years and you hated the experience of working with them in a group and now you don't like going to work. So I know that small group communication is kind of frustrating. I want to practice it in sort of an artificial setting so that you all get better at it before you head out into the workforce, because you're going to have times when you have to work with people that you don't really like. I want to make sure that you have strategies for how you're going to handle that. Another strategy I have for you is to meet in person whenever you possibly can. I told you that my online students have slightly different requirements. The reason for that is because online small group communication is really hard to do well. I took small group communication as an undergrad. It was the one class in the major that I got an A- instead of an A. The reason for that was because of a project that we had to do in that class that my group did not handle very well. The project was to plan a trip to Europe. So we had a $3,000 budget, and there were 4 of us in the group, and the only condition that we had for planning that was that we had to do the entire project only online. We were not allowed to meet face-to-face. We had to turn in transcripts of our conversation to our instructor. It was a miserable experience because a lot of people wouldn't meet when the group was meeting. One of the differences between online and offline communication has to do with what communication scholars call synchronicity. If you've ever seen synchronized swimmers, it's a whole bunch of people all doing the same motions at the same time. And they've all been trained and they've all spent a lot of time practicing to do things at the same time. By nature of being face-to-face, you all will be meeting in the same place at the same time. When we take that into online environments, what often happens is people are like, oh, I'll just create a GroupMe. I'll just create a Facebook group. I'll just create a Google Doc, and they start putting stuff in there. And the leader puts something in on Tuesday, somebody else sees it Tuesday night, somebody else sees it on Thursday, someone else sees it on Sunday, somebody else doesn't even check the GroupMe and says, I don't even have access to this GroupMe. So I want you to be making sure that whenever possible, you can avoid that problem of asynchronous communication, communication that's not happening at the same time, and instead to work together. I've told your lab instructors to give you some time in lab to work through this project. It's your major assignment between now and the end of the semester. That's the biggest thing that you're working on, so you should have some time in class to do that. That said, I don't know that your in-class time is going to be enough time for you all to do what you need to do. You want to meet early, you want to set a lot of deadlines, you want to meet in person whenever you possibly can. The last recommendation I have for you is to strive to function as much as you can as a team rather than a bunch of individuals. That will show if your presentation is not really well thought out. It'll show in your evidence and reasoning if your best possible solution isn't a good one. It will show in your delivery if somebody is really taking the lead on something and somebody else is reading from a manuscript. It will show in a lot of different ways, and I want you to see this project not just as my own public speech, but instead as a group public speech. I'm not just one individual among 6 to 8. We are a team of 6 to 8. We're in this together. One of the ways that this manifests often, it's manifested so often that I've put it into my rubric for grading this. When you transition from one person to another, the most common transition in a group speech is, now that I've talked about this, Jessica's going to tell you about that. Now that Jessica's talked to you about that, Bryce is going to talk to you about that. I don't like seeing that because what it says is that each individual wrote their own part of that group preparation outline and that you weren't really functioning much as a team. So I'd like to encourage you all to be creative, not just in how you make teamwork happen when you're deliberating behind the scenes, but also how you do that in your presentations. So I know this is kind of scary. I'm hoping that at least with some misconceptions, you know how to go into this. You know how to prevent groupthink and social loafing and other small communication problems. I want to remind you all that your lab instructors and I are here to help you with this project. I also want to remind you all that this project usually goes really well. It's very rare that I have a team that is totally dysfunctional and I have to intervene. And if I do have to intervene, it usually goes well for the people who are doing their part and poorly for the people who are not. So I want to encourage you to be as creative as possible, to take seriously that public sphere role that we talked about last week. Try and come up with a clever solution to a good problem. Do your best not to kill each other as group members, and remember that we're here to help you if you need it. I'll see you next week.